CityCast from Explocity.
It seems the deeper you go, the more the deep goes off the chart, scratching at the tip of all that you know. Mountain, ocean, space, and heart. What matters, what lives, what wells of gravity send us rolling along on the curve of reality. A year in a day, a moment in a lifetime, and tomorrow comes like a stolen rhyme. Tomorrow always comes. Tomorrow always comes. Tomorrow always comes. Tomorrow always comes. Tomorrow.
Not many of us are aware that literature was a major influence on rock music. Rock or folk lyricists of the 60s and the 70s, and spilling into later years, were very well read. Many of them were students of English literature, highly educated. Here are only a few examples. Jim Morrison's skills included poetry. In 1970, he published 2 volumes, The Lords / Notes on Vision and New Creatures. In fact, he named the band The Doors in reference to a quote from William Blake, which went like this: "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear as it is, infinite." Chris Martin of Coldplay mastered Greek and Latin at the University College in London's Faculty of Ancient History. Sterling Morrison, the Velvet Underground guitarist, has a Ph.D. in medieval literature, and Rivers Cuomo of the band Weezer graduated from Harvard in English, and Jeff Schroeder of the Smashing Pumpkins is currently working on his Ph.D. in comparative literature at UCLA. And a couple of honourable mentions. Brian May of Queen, everyone knows him from the movie, is a Ph.D. in astrophysics and has worked at NASA, among other things. And Art Garfunkel has a master's in math. Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine graduated from Harvard in political science. These and other rockers are very well read, and their lyrics reflected that knowledge. I mean, I don't know if people still come to blows over the interpretation of Glenn Frey's Hotel California lyrics. No less than they do Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky. And then there are the songs inspired by literature. Wuthering Heights by Kate Bush, Emily Bronte. Pigs by Pink Floyd was inspired by George Orwell's 1984, as was Testify by Rage Against the Machine. White Rabbit by Jefferson Airplane was a shout-out, obviously, to Alice in Wonderland. Sympathy for the Devil by the Rolling Stones was inspired by Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, and also by Baudelaire's The World. Metallica's For Whom the Bell Tolls is, of course, straight from Hemingway, and India's mega band of the 70s, the Human Bondage, got its name from the title of a Somerset Maugham book. This sort of puts paid to the whole undereducated, unwashed, drug-taking bad boys of rock. Well, at least not the undereducated part. My guest today is Bruce Lee Money. He is frontman of the famous Indian rock band Thermal and a Quarter, and he runs the reputable music school TAC Academy. Today, we are going to talk about how his lifelong interest in words and literature shaped his songwriting. That piece of music with those evocative lyrics that you heard coming into this segment was Bruce, singing all the vocal parts a cappella of one of his songs, Tomorrow. At the end of this episode, another treat, we will have Bruce performing The Kindness of Strangers in a songwriter showcase. Both videos are on Explocity's YouTube channel. There's a link in the podcast description. And with that, here he is, Bruce Lee Money. Happy to have you on the show, and welcome to the Literary City.
Thank you very much for having me, Ramji.
When I was researching you for this interview, I heard a lot of your lyrics, and my first thought was, oh yeah, he's well-read. So, Bruce Lee Money, are you well-read?
Well, if I manage to give that impression, I'm sure there must be something behind it. So,
The 60s and the 70s were a time of anti-establishment protest, weren't they?
Beginning of the counterculture.
Counterculture, exactly. As I said in my intro, you could clearly see that their writing was very influenced by literature. I'm saying the same about you.
Definitely. I'd say that I've definitely been inspired more by the books I've read. For the lyrics that I write, I've definitely been inspired more by books that I've read than by songs I've heard. Of course, song lyrics also do inspire. But then, like you said, many of the songs that you spoke about are also, again, derived from literary influences. So it just, it's a different way of getting the same message, I suppose. Definitely. Yeah, of course.
Okay, let's give that a shot now.
Okay.
What or who was your major literary influence?
Very hard to pinpoint one. I was lucky enough to grow up in a household with loads and loads of books, all kinds of books. My father refused to buy a TV till I was 14 or 15 years old. So we had no TV at home. So my recourse was books. So in terms of literary influences, much like my musical influences, they change from time to time. I can't really say that there's been one influence throughout 25 years of making music right now.
But if you shake the tree, which apples fall?
So I guess one of the writers that had a kind of pivotal influence on just the way I thought about things and life and everything in general was somebody I read when I was 16, which was Douglas Adams.
The Hitchhiker's Guide, right?
Yeah, the Hitchhiker's Guide series, and of course the Dirk Gently detective series. I've always been a huge science fiction buff. The genre of fiction and non-fiction that I read the most, which is science fiction and speculative fiction.
What about poetry? I'm sure that poetry came into it as a lyricist.
Poetry as well. I remember being very much into Lord Byron, from Lord Byron to Emily Dickinson to some Sufi poets. I've read a lot of that stuff as well.
So did the career path go straight from literature to music, or were there any tangential forays?
I did science up to my 12th grade, or PUC as we call it here, because at that point, the only thing I wanted to do with my life was be a pilot. I had no musical aspirations whatsoever.
How interesting. Was that also Douglas Adams inspired?
No, not really, because the fascination with flight in general started when I was 5 or 6 years old. It's the only thing I wanted to do with my life, which was fly fighter aeroplanes. I wanted to join the NDA and become a fighter pilot. That was my pretty much single-minded goal throughout my schooling years, which is why
I know that would have been too early to have been inspired by Top Gun, right?
This was way before Top Gun, way before Top Gun. So Mr. Maverick had no influence on this. I don't know. I've always been fascinated by aeroplanes, and even now I can look out and tell you if it's a Pratt & Whitney turbofan or a Rolls-Royce Merlin or one of those things,
Yeah, essential knowledge for a rock musician, isn't it?
So I was pretty anal about that, but in my 11th grade I lost my dad. He passed away in an accident, and suddenly life changed completely. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. He was a big influence in my life. He was a very alternative kind of career person himself. He did all kinds of crazy things through his life, and pretty much encouraged me to do the same. He always thought differently. But yeah, I lost him, and I was the only son, and so I couldn't leave home at that point and suddenly run off and join the NDA and things like that. So things just completely changed. And I've always liked music because I grew up again with a lot of music in the house. My mother is a trained Carnatic singer, and so there was a lot of Carnatic music playing at home. But Dad was very much into Western music, so there was a lot of jazz and pop and stuff from the 40s and 50s again that played a lot at home. So I grew up with that kind of mix. But after I finished my 12th grade, I did my undergraduate studies in journalism, psychology, and literature. And so that again got me more into language and writing and all of that stuff.
Cycling back to Emily Dickinson, didn't you tell me that you had a favorite passage of hers?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that stuck with me. I've read a lot of her, but this one is like a piece of food that lodges in a tooth and you can't get it out. It's just kind of in your head.
I'm sure that that's the first time anyone has compared Emily Dickinson to an errant piece of spinach.
I mean, she was quite an iconoclast at that point, so maybe she wouldn't mind. But it also references this whole life in show business or in some kind of, public facing kind of thing.
What are the lines? Let's hear them. Recite the lines.
The lines are, how dreary it is to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong day to an admiring bog. So
the people who will understand that the most will be people who have experienced some amount of fame, correct?
Well, I don't know about fame, but yeah, I mean, it's it kind of...
Well, some might say that it's all very well for you to say that now that you're famous.
Hardly. I mean, I think in terms of fame or whatever else, it's the kind of music that we do and the kind of things that we've done. It's never been mainstream in that sense. It's always been a little weird and niche and oddball. So it's been a very different kind of thing. But I'm just really grateful that I've been able to do this for this long and continue to do it. So
let's talk about these very well-educated rock musicians and how literature helped them write their lyrics.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at many, I'd say, thinking, reflective songwriters, they will, I guess it goes with the territory. I mean, they would have spent some time studying language, studying, the use of language, and also sometimes studying things that are completely, not connected with music at all in many ways. I mean, the guys from Steely Dan, I think they were studying, again, some kind of arts. They were art majors at Bard College or something like that. And when they if you look at their lyrics and if you look at how they approach the themes that they focus on, it's very unique. It's very different. It's very obtuse. It's sometimes very difficult to get inside. It's very personal, and that's one way of looking at it. I was recently listening to another singer-songwriter called Sufjan Stevens. I don't know if you've heard of him. Sufjan, Sufjan Stevens. Very unusual, very interesting. His lyrics, his overall approach to putting songs together. Lyrics that dare to be a little bit more layered, a little bit more nuanced, allowing varieties of interpretation for the people who consume it. There's automatically some love of language in there, right? Some love of the use of language itself.
I could say the same about you and your music and lyrics, correct?
Definitely. Yeah, of course. Speaking of my own songs, there's a writer called Tom Robbins, and there's a book of his called Skinny Legs and All. And a lot of the perspectives in that book, which is about, how your reality is just based on your perception for the most part, is in a song called Bend the World, which we put out in 2005. There's that's completely inspired by the philosophy of that book, I suppose, if not really the story or whatever else, just the perspectives in that book. Then there's there's a song called Fly, which is completely Douglas Adams' if you want to fly, you have to throw yourself at the ground and miss. You can't help but like that.
And here's something else that I can't help but like. It is from your song Galactica. May I read them out?
Okay.
Sometimes I wish I'd never learned to read a word. A letter turned right side up or upside down, all the same. Even my body is advertising space. The scraps of decency that cover my disgrace. Provocative stuff.
Okay.
But you have to tell us what these words mean.
So Galactica was...
that's how you say it, Galactica.
The inspiration behind Galactica was actually hoardings around the cities that we live in, which is something that across the last 4 or 5 years, now that the hoardings are gone, we've kind of gotten used to not reading something at every moment of your life outside of your home, which is why it says the streets, they have too many names, screaming, shouting, neon lighting in my face, behind my eyes all the time. And then sometimes I wish I'd never learned to read a word or a letter turned right side up. You see all these graphic design things with the letters all over the place, but you're still trying to read it because, you can read. It was supposed to kind of typify the noise in your head. Yeah.
You'll find a link to the song in the podcast description. And very quickly for our US listeners, hoardings are what you call billboards.
Yes, billboards.
This reminds me of Ogden Nash's spoof on Joyce Kilmer's poem. You know that one? I think it goes, I think that I shall never see a billboard lovely as a tree. Perhaps Unless the billboards fall, I'll never see a tree at all.
I don't remember that one, but I have a lot of Ogden Nash, and yeah, I mean, I do remember reading this of Ogden Nash, but I don't think it was part of the song's genesis in any way. It was just, us driving around Bangalore saying, this is horrible. I mean, is there some way we can not look at these things?
Well, your wish came true, didn't it? No more billboards.
Yeah, it did. I was quite surprised. In fact, for a few years, we were quite cynical, saying this is going to last 6 months, and then it's all going to be back.
Well, it's all stuck in the courts, isn't it? But on the plus side, here's a case of justice delayed, justice delivered. The tightness of writing is often captured in opening lines. Do you have any favorites?
Absolutely. And that's Douglas Adams again.
Which one is it? And will you read it out?
Yeah, I don't have to read it out. It's in my head.
Oh, cool. All right. Let her rip.
Far out in the uncharted backwaters of the unfashionable end of the third spiral arm of the galaxy lies a small, unregarded yellow sun. Orbiting this at a distance of roughly 93 million miles is an utterly insignificant little blue-green planet whose ape-descended life forms are so amazingly primitive that they still think digital watches are a pretty neat idea.
Dramatic. Hitchhiker's Guide.
Introduction to the Hitchhiker's Guide, and it's still very much part of my worldview, which is about insignificance and assumption of importance and things like that.
Right, and as opening lines go, that one is right up there.
That's the opening line, and I was hooked. I read that and I was like, okay, this is amazing. I've got to read all of this guy's work from here on.
And I wonder what planet he's talking about. What about movies? Have any movies inspired you as much as books have?
I'd say one of the movies across the last few years that still stays with me, also because I've always wanted to study linguistics. I wanted to go and actually do a degree in linguistics at some point, and I think I will. But this science fiction movie called Arrival is something that is very related to the ideas of language and thought, and how for most of us, we think using language, and so therefore the connection between the ideas of how language itself works, and therefore how it shapes your thought, and therefore all of your action and everything else, is, I find, very fascinating. And that movie delves into it in a very science fiction way, bringing in these aliens and their language, and how when a human learns their language, their whole ideas of their whole thought process, and therefore even their perception of time itself changes, which obviously is very far-fetched and stuff, but it is a fascinating idea. And it's definitely one of the movies across the last 4 or 5 years that has remained with me in terms of just something interesting to think about.
So are your favorite song lyrics necessarily literary?
I mean, some of them definitely are. Some of them definitely have allusions to literary things. But I think some of the ones that again stay with me are the ones where again the songwriter has managed to use his love of language and his craft of using language, but not use it in a way that highlights his ability with the language, but in a way that actually connects very deeply with lived experience. I mean, that's why I love songwriters like Leonard Cohen, or even Bob Dylan, or Tom Waits, or any of these people who tell stories of lived experience. And I think through my own kind of musical career, it's always struck me that, technically you could be a great technician, you could be a great craftsman with either the notes or chords that you use, or the words that you know. But if you don't have the integrity of honest lived experience behind what you're trying to say, sometimes something is missing. And I find that there's no replacement for that. You have to allow things to happen to you, and you have to convert those into the songs that you write, and that's where your craft and everything else comes into play, obviously. But it has to be, the core of it still has to be something that is lived experience, and that's what resonates most with me.
Without casting judgment, we can agree reading is not what it used to be. So what is a modern young songwriter going to fall back on without literature and without much life experience?
You're probably right in terms of saying that there seems to be a lack of depth in the lyrics and in the message of the songs themselves. And I think to a large extent, that kind of stuff still exists today. It's just that the sheer volume of content that's coming out right now is several orders of magnitude larger than what was coming out 20, 30 years ago, simply because the process of producing music itself is now so democratized, so simple. All you need is a room, a computer, and you can put out all the music that you want. And so the stuff that floats to the top of this glut of content is the stuff that's pushed the hardest in terms of marketing and driven the most by algorithmic and marketing related forces rather than anything else. That most of the time you seem to think that the good stuff isn't there, but I think it is. I think it's definitely there. It's just harder to find.
You're charitable and decent, and you know what? You're like a sponge that's never going to stop learning.
Wow. Okay. I'm glad you think that. I'd like to think of myself that way. Yes. It's me waking up every morning saying, I want to do something today.
And clearly, craft is important to you. Small wonder you run a school.
Thanks. Yes. And, but craft, definitely, it's something that, again, being mostly self-taught, I've learned more from getting my ass kicked playing with people who are way ahead of me in every possible way.
Tell me about it. Your school, Techademy, can anyone join?
Anybody at any level. We start at age 4, and I think our oldest student right now is 78.
Cool. Looks like you've got it all covered. And there's a link in the podcast description to the school website. Bruce, it's been a complete pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being here.
You as well, Ramji. Thanks so much.
And remember, as I said, Bruce Lee Money will sing for us at the end of this episode. And coming up next, what's that word? Stay tuned. And now for that also-popular segment, what's that word? Words and phrases that we use all the time, but never stop to think about their origins. And to help me with it, here's my co-host, the protector of the phrase and the watchdog of the word, live from some sort of clothes cupboard she passes off as a soundstage. I will let her introduce herself. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Pranati, but you can call me P. And that's P with an A, not another E. And by the way, I'm not in a clothes cupboard. This is a walk-in closet.
Oh, excuse me. Sorry, Bradshaw.
Yes, I asked for that.
Okay, P with an A, what's the word?
Yeah, so usually I pick up on something that you or the guest use in your conversation.
Uh-huh.
Today's word is sort of generic and not specific.
Generic? You mean like the or and?
No, I mean, you were talking to Bruce Lee Money, and both of you kept talking about rock music lyrics and kept jousting with quotes.
Jousting? Jousting with quotes? Well, yeah. Bruce and I, we are very competitive people.
Oh, really? How do you know he's competitive?
Well, I don't, but I have a feeling that he came in first in the egg and spoon race in primary school. He's the type.
And you didn't?
You know what they say? To make an omelette, you must first break an egg.
That's a funny one.
Well, I'm sure that our listeners are hungering for the last details of my failed sports career in primary school. So let me ask you again, what's the word?
The phrase today is rock and roll.
Ooh, that is generic and clever. Splendid call.
Yeah, actually, Radha Thomas, the jazz singer.
I sort of know her.
She was the lead singer of the rock band, the Human Bondage, that you referenced in your monologue.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, so she asked if I knew the etymology of rock and roll.
Nice. And?
And here we are.
Okay, cool. So let's dive into that. The phrase rock and roll, the phrase's original usage was maritime, sailing. It was coined in the 17th century to describe the movement of the ship on the waves, rocking and rolling.
Yeah, like in the last 3 episodes, so many of the phrases that we've mentioned have all had origins sailing.
Or references to sailing. Yes, you're right. Come to think of that. You're right. Well, They say sailors have colorful language. I guess that it's not only bad words. Well,
yeah.
so anyway, rock and roll in the maritime context used to refer to the movement of a ship, the rocking and the rolling of it.
Right.
And then that phrase started to get applied to anything that had that same rocking rhythmic movement, romantically. Nothing? Okay, cue Lonely Sailor.
Hey, that's naughty.
By 1920, that phrase had come to be used mainly by the African American community as a euphemism for dancing or sex. In time, the sexual references sort of died down, and rock and roll became a phrase principally used to describe dancing.
Right.
And finally, it came to rest as a musical genre in its shortened form, rock and roll, with the and written with only an N, rock and roll.
And yeah, that's interesting.
And the earliest reference that etymologists frequently quote is Trixie Smith's 1922 blues ballad, which was titled, "My Man Rocks Me with One Steady Roll."
Oh, my.
Yeah, its meaning covering both sex and dancing, and by association, music.
Okay, so no more mention of boats whatsoever.
No more boats. That ship had sailed. Anyway, so this disc jockey in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1950s called Alan Freed used the phrase the rock and roll session to describe the kind of, jumped up country music with urgent primal rhythms and blues that he played on his radio show. And he was the first guy to do that. And it was the early 50s. Now, as his radio show gained popularity, so did the phrase rock and roll as a genre of that music. Now, just think about this. Had he tried to promote a rock and roll party just a couple of decades earlier, it would have caused a complete and total outrage and would have caused gentle ladies to reach for their smelling salts.
Yeah. But what's the etymology of the phrase itself? Because all of this is pretty recent history.
It's true.
Early 50s and all.
Well, the word rock in this context, not in the geological context, came from the Old Norse or the Old Nordic, rika, which meant to pull or tug or tear or move. And they still use that in the Icelandic dialect or language. Apparently, Icelandic, the modern Icelandic, is still very Old Norse, or so I'm told.
Right.
Anyway, so that rock plus the roll went into sailing and referred to the movement.
Okay. So is there like a rock and roll period?
For the music, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's loosely mid-40s to the mid-60s was the rock and roll period, but that was specifically the music that you could refer to as rock and roll, like Chuck Berry or early Elvis, that sort of stuff.
Okay. So rock music is a larger genre?
Quite right, because rock and roll led to what we call rock, and that is the music of the Beatles, Led Zepp, people like that, The Who.
I know that phrase is also used in the let's go context, as in let's rock and roll, buddy.
Hey, yeah, that's used pretty commonly. That is so true. Yeah. And here's something else I found out. I mentioned that they shortened the and in rock and roll to rock and roll, right?
Yeah, they do.
Well, that shortening is called apocopation, the omission of the final sound of a word.
Apocopation?
Yeah. Apocopation.
Such a big word to describe how they make words smaller. Isn't that ironic?
That is ironic. That is true. The phrase rock and roll is also used in Cockney rhyming slang.
I like Cockney rhyming slang. Hit me with one.
All right. So when they lose their jobs and go on welfare, they might say, I'm back on rock and roll, which is Cockney rhyming slang for I'm back on the dole.
Yeah, I get it.
Do you know what they mean when they refer to a man and they say, well, he's brown bread?
No.
It means he's dead. Poor guy.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Do they have a word for the opposite of apocopation?
What do you mean by opposite?
Like adding a final syllable instead of dropping it, opposite of apocompation. Huh. You want an example?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah. Okay, here. Bye.
A reverse apocompation that I wish I heard more often.
Hey, that's mean.
Okay, P with an A, that was great fun. Let's do it again next week. Now, if you have a phrase that confuses, confounds, or intrigues you, or you think does to us, we'd love to discuss it with you live on the air. So write to us, theliterarycity@explocity.com or simply tlc@explocity.com, or go to our Facebook page, Bangalore Literary Society, or Instagram, Explocity BLR. If we like your question, we will call you. In all our previous episodes, we have asked you to find it in your heart to make a contribution to the Association of People with Disabilities. We learned that many of you have made contributions, and this makes us very happy. A heartfelt, warm thank you from all of us, not the least from the children at apd-india.org. And if you visit that website, you'll find out how you might be able to make a donation too. Teach a child to fish. And that is our show. Thank you so much for being here, and see you again next Wednesday. And now, as promised, we will leave you with Bruce Lee Money performing The Kindness of Strangers.
You don't really know them so well, but kindness isn't owned by friends. It flows stronger than water, a spell, a die cast with no wager or ends. And somewhere the dots connect, and that to lift your heart sudden and sad. Somewhere a fulcrum turns this world to more than rock, to love, to meld. I'll take this bet before the sun has set. I'll take this bet before the sun has set.